Hello, today I will be showing you how to make a linoleum block print using this rubbery linoleum. First off, you have to have your drawing drawn on a piece of paper that is about the same size as your linoleum block. That's because I could use a pencil and draw directly on this linoleum block. However, I don't think that that would be a smart choice because it may not result in smart compositional decisions. If I draw it on my paper, I feel like it's relatively low stakes. If I make mistakes, I can easily erase it. Plus, if I put it on my linoleum block, maybe I want to play around with how it is framed on the paper. So once it is drawn in pencil and I like how it looks, I need to ask myself if I did make those smart compositional decisions. In this case, I drew a squirrel. Did I draw that squirrel large enough? The area inside of the squirrel is my positive space. The area in the background, the unimportant part, is the negative space. So I know that the squirrel is a positive space because the squirrel is the main focus. And a smart compositional decision would be drawing that squirrel, or in this case, the positive space, as large as I can to fit most of this rectangle. If I had to give this a percentage, I'd say the squirrel takes up about 80% of my drawing. So I like how it looks. I erased mistakes I didn't like. And my next step is to transfer that on my linoleum block. So in order to transfer, I'm going to use a technique that is a lot like transfer paper or tracing paper or carbon paper. I want to scribble on the back of my paper just to get a solid layer of graphite on there. And I am going to line up my squirrel picture onto my linoleum block. Around now, since I chose my linoleum block, I need to make sure my name and class code's on the back. Now is the time where if I don't like how this is framed on the paper, if I want that squirrel peeking in from the corner instead, all I have to do is tape this on sideways. However, I think this looks just fine as is. You can choose to tape it in place. However, sometimes there's some kinds of linoleum that don't tape in place very well. If the surface is still powdery, you might want to wash off that powder. That might get in the way of you transferring. And I just tape the top and the bottom so it doesn't slide around. If it doesn't fit perfectly, that's okay. Just fit it as best as you can. So the idea is I'm tracing over my line work. I didn't do any shading, just outlines with a pen. And I'm using a pen because if I use a graphite pencil, the tip may not be sharp enough. And with a pen, there's at least a metal tip that does a really good job of pressing the graphite on the back of this paper into the linoleum surface. You want to press pretty hard. You don't want to press so hard that you're making a hole in your paper, but you do want to press pretty hard. Other vocab words that will help you create interesting compositional decisions besides positive space and negative space is implied lines. There are some areas where I did not connect my lines all the way around, where the line got so thin it became invisible in part of a place, and your eye filled in where that line would naturally connect. Kind of like right here, those lines don't quite connect, but your eye fills in that line. Right here, the top of the head did not outline where the ear is. There are other parts on like the fingers and on the nose. Implied lines will create pretty good interest in your project. In addition to that, I also need texture because that will also make a smart compositional decision. I had fur texture up here, I have fur texture down here, and just to kind of make things interesting, might want to put more fur texture in other areas as well. If you have something else with a different texture like scales or feathers, please be sure to include those. So now that I traced everything, I can maybe peek underneath it to see if my image transferred, and some linoleum blocks transfer more efficiently than others. I do see my picture, however, it's a little messy and hard to see. So right around now, I might want to re-outline a couple things just to make sure I understand where they're going. I might want to eventually go in with Sharpie and re-outline it so that my lines are permanent with that Sharpie line. So now that this is outlined, I want to go over and maybe give my linoleum block a quick rinse so that it's clean for the next steps in the project. You may find that the graphite that transferred and smudged in areas may not go away. That's okay, it will not affect your final print. So my next steps are to start carving my linoleum so that I end up with something that is much like a stamp, like this example. So I am going to carve the negative spaces, the background area, and leave the positive space or the focus, the exciting part. Carve away the parts you do not want. So when I move on to this next step, I'm going to need some tools. I'm going to need a bench hook. I'm going to need gouges, and the idea is when you start carving, you have your bench hook here for safety so that you don't carve away parts of your finger by accident. So if you look carefully at your gouge, you're going to notice that it has different widths that it carves away. This one right here, if you look carefully, has a number 2, which means that the line it will carve will get you a thinner, smaller line, while as this one has a 4 on it, and it's going to give me a wider line. If you look carefully, this is more of a pointed V shape, and this is more of a U shape that will get me a wider line. So when I first start carving, I might want to start carving the outlines of my design first and then carve away the bigger areas. That way it's easier to stay inside of those lines that I carved out. So always have your linoleum block up against the end of your bench hook and always carve away from yourself. Never, ever, ever hold your linoleum block in place with your hands and carve towards your hands. That's when people make mistakes. There are gouge slips and they accidentally get themselves. So your bench hook is here for safety. So I get my gouge into an area, just maybe somewhere along the side. Make sure it has a little chunk of linoleum because it's carving into it, and carve away from yourself. I use my other hand here just kind of for stability. And if I get to a corner where I have to change directions, I'm just going to take away that extra linoleum and come in through a different angle instead of changing directions. Now with these whiskers, I don't want to carve the whiskers as an indent because that will blend in with the background. So I'm going to try to carve the outline around those whiskers so that when I do print my animal, the squirrel itself will be some color ink and the whiskers will also be that color ink instead of it being a white outline that will just blend in with the background. All right, so looking at my design, I made some decisions to not carve away the inside of my squirrel. I could have on the eyes, but then his eyes would have looked probably too white, maybe like they were glowing. I could have on his teeth, but I felt like I wanted to keep most of my positive space all an ink color and the negative space all its own separate color. And now I want to carve the negative space of my design so that the background is all white and my squirrel is all an ink color. So you need to choose which line direction you want to go in, because like in this design, I thought that I was carving away pretty efficiently. Every now and then, if you look really carefully, you can see some dark areas. Ink got on those spots anyway. So if I am going to have ink accidentally get in unintentional spots, it might as well look nice. So in this design, I made my lines all go horizontal. Maybe you want them to be vertical. Maybe you want them to be diagonal, depending on your composition. I'm going to switch to a wider gouge to carve that background space and carve most of that background all in a single direction. Right around here it's going to get tricky because I want to carve this part, not the ear, this part, not the ear. So maybe it would be smart if you chose to start your carving at where the outline of the squirrel is, and then away from that area, and maybe switch directions for the other side. That way, if I'm carving this side of the linoleum block, if my gouge slips, it doesn't do any damage to my actual design. If it slips, it goes over here and just hits my bench hook. However, if I start on this side and carve towards my squirrel and then it slips, I'm carving away the parts that I can't undo. So now that all of my negative space is carved away and my positive space is the only thing left, I touched up a couple little areas, like I carved a little bit deeper. If you look at the side, I still didn't carve very deep. So honestly, I'd rather you carve deeper rather than too shallow in case you get ink on those areas you don't intend to. However, I can always go in and change that later. I don't want to carve so deep that there's a hole. Other areas I touched up are I made line quality changes in some areas. I made these lines thicker than some of the other lines that I left. And I'm ready to ink up my print and press it onto paper. So, in order to do that, I need a plastic tray. And I need my ink. So I think the first one I'm gonna do is just gonna be regular black. One of your prints should just be in regular black ink. Some of your prints should be in color. One of your prints should be a rainbow. So again, one should be black, one should be rainbow, and with the rest of your prints, you should be doing them in color. You should end up with multiples. That's the beauty of this project. You can play with different colors to see which one works best for you. So since I'm using just regular black and I'm not mixing a fancy color, I'm going to use a popsicle stick and put this in the plastic tray over there. Mix up the ink pretty good because you want to make sure that there isn't any separation. This stuff does wash out of your clothes, so if you get it in your clothes, please wash it as quickly as possible so it doesn't stain. However, don't test that. So I'm going to get my brayer. I'm just going to, first off, I just made a line of ink near the top, and I'm not going to evenly distribute that. I'm going to go towards this little stash of ink here whenever my swatch down here gets a little bit low on ink, and I'm always going to roll away from myself. I might roll back and forth a little bit just to kind of work the ink. So now that I have an even swatch of ink and I have inked up my brayer, I want to roll away from myself on my linoleum block, and what you see is what you get. So if you get ink on a place you don't want, it will probably show up on your final print. You want it to make that tacky noise that you're hearing right now. And I, every now and then, move my linoleum block just to get it. If it looks see-through in an area, it will probably print see-through. So I have my papers here. What I want to do is take my linoleum block, put it linoleum side down on that paper, just because it's easier for me to line it up and make sure that the border around it is relatively even. The moment it touches the paper, you don't want to lift it up and adjust it because it has already pressed ink onto that paper. Flip it so that the paper is side up, and you're going to grab a baren. This helps you press the paper from behind. You could use a spoon or some other flat surface, but a baren works pretty well for this. I'm going to start on the upper left-hand corner, press pretty hard. My other hand is holding the paper steady, and use circular motions from left to right and then down, and try to get the overall surface. Make sure to get the corners especially good, and lift it up from the top on down. Now, you know it's a good print if there is no speckling. You know it's a good print if it didn't smudge on you. I do see a little speckling here, which means maybe I didn't wash my linoleum block efficiently enough before printing just now. Sometimes that happens when debris gets into the design, so you can always pick that off and try again. I can always save that little area by, and here's a little cheat, just kind of pressing on that area, just tapping on it with a finger. You don't want to do that too much. You don't want to rely on it because you don't want fingerprints all over your print, but you have to do that while the ink is still wet. I see there are some areas where the ink filled in my carving, so maybe right now I want to go in and touch up those areas and carve them a little deeper. If you want to keep printing with this color, you got to work quickly. You don't want to wash the linoleum block only to print with that same black color ink again. It would be wasting my ink. All I have to do is put more ink on top of that linoleum block and print again. Problem is though, the swatch of ink I made over here is getting too thin. So I might need to press my brayer into that ink line right here and evenly distribute that over here. What you don't do is take the ink and roll it all flat, not unless you are near the end of your ink and this has almost run out. Again, this is what you go to when this gets too thin. Now I think this one turned out a little bit better, but it has definitely confirmed that those areas right here are getting filled in too easily, so I definitely need to carve those away. I think I'm going to switch colors of ink, so now would be the time for me to wash my linoleum block, and I'll show you how to mix your own unique color of ink and print with a rainbow print. I am now ready to show you a rainbow print using other colors. Again, if you're using a regular brown right out of the ink jar, you're just going to take a popsicle stick and make a line of that near the top of your plastic tray. However, I think I want to mix a unique, interesting color. So I will have these little plastic cups laying around. You're going to put your ink into that cup and mix a brand new special color that doesn't come right out of the bottle. Make sure not to cross-contaminate because usually the lighter colored inks, like yellow or white, gets a little bit of ink from another color and it just ruins the whole jar, depending. So I'm going to grab some of that ink, put it in this cup, and you're going to wash these popsicle sticks when you are done getting ink all over them so that we can reuse them as many times as we can. I'm going to make a light brown color. And make sure to add little bits of your darker color at a time so that if you end up adding too much brown into this white, you don't have to go backwards and add more white back into it because you're going to have to use a lot of white to undo how much you darkened this color ink, whereas you only need little bits of brown at a time to get the color that you want here. When doing a rainbow print, you don't necessarily need the rainbow colors for it to be a rainbow print. As long as it blends, it is a rainbow print. So I'm going to be doing light brown and red. So I'm still going to make my line of ink going along the top. I'm just going to do half of a light brown and half of red, and we'll see how that looks. I'm going to choose two colors that are relatively similar or close to each other on the color wheel, because if I use two opposite colors, it might mix to make an interesting unintentional color in between. So stick with colors that are next to each other or similar. And I'm just doing what I otherwise did with my black ink, which is make a line. However, this time I did light brown touching red. And I'm going to choose a longer brayer to roll ink onto my linoleum block because I want it to blend a longer distance. So I'm going to, just like last time, get ink on my brayer, just a line of it, and try to roll that swatch out down here by rolling away from myself. Sometimes rolling back and forth to get the ink. I noticed I didn't get enough red on there. It looks a little too see-through. And now is the moment of truth. You have to decide what part is light brown, what part is red. I think I want the lighter color to be down below here. And maybe I want to roll it like this. Maybe I want it more at an angle. That is up to you how you want this. So since it's not blending all that much, I might want to bring my brayer slowly down every time I roll this. And then slightly back up to bring that lighter color back into the face a little bit more. I don't think I want it to blend too subtly. I want to be able to make it look like there certainly is a blend in it and it's not too hard to see. If ink gets on these areas right there, you can either get that with a slightly wet sponge, don't get water all over the whole thing, or you can quickly carve those areas away. Careful though, you don't want these little bits of linoleum getting on your inked up areas, and you don't want to take too long doing this, because if your ink dries on the linoleum block, it will appear to be too speckly when you print it. So just like last time, I'm going to get my paper. Make sure your fingers aren't too inky, otherwise you're going to get fingerprints all over your paper, and that will be a craftsmanship issue. And you're going to line that up as carefully as you can. And that is my print. So you keep doing that however many times you need to until you have the right number of prints. If you switch colors, be sure to wash your linoleum block. But since I might continue printing with this same color, I'm gonna keep using the same ink tray and just keep inking it back up again. When you are all done with all of your prints, you are ready to label your project. So there are 3 parts to labeling your linoleum block prints. We're going to start with the left, middle, and then the right. You're going to label the lower part. I would write really lightly, and I would write pretty low down on the paper, because if it's getting framed, we probably don't want those parts to show depending on the print. However, this is what the professional printmakers end up doing with their projects. The lower left, you're going to count up how many linoleum block prints you have done in total. So for me right now, just because I was demonstrating on camera, I have about 3. So this one is probably going to be the first one I made out of 3. You're going to write down fractions. This one was about the second one, so I'm going to write down 2 out of 3 total prints. This is my final print I did, so that's 3 out of 3 prints. That way, if people notice that prints are floating around that are the same kind of print, but there are definitely more than 3, we know there might be fakes out there. Then you're going to title your print in quotation marks. So for my printmaking project, I think I'm just gonna name it No Caffeine. End quotes. Make sure to use capitals and make sure to use quotation marks, otherwise it's not quite complete. And then on the bottom right, you write your name or sign your name. Once it has those 3 parts, the fraction, the title in quotation marks and capitals, and your name, you're ready to hand those things in. Good luck.